This should continue until Europe does what it really must do, which is ramp up its own defence industry at scale and at pace. And that's going better, as indeed is the increase in industrial production in Ukraine itself.
The talk has been of land swaps and of difficult compromises. President Zelensky has ruled out handing over the Donbass. But last night, the White House said the meeting would be, and I quote here, a listening exercise for President Trump. So is President Putin going to be dominating that meeting? Well, whatever is decided about Ukraine's future will have implications for European security and could impact on the UK's defence policy. General Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of Joint Forces Command and co-author, of course, of the Strategic Defence Review, joins us now. Sir Richard, thank you for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning.
What do you make of this phrase, listening exercise? Is this the White House trying to lower expectations?
Yes, I think it clearly is. I think when this meeting was first spoken of, perhaps in President Trump's mind, there was an expectation that this would be the grand moment when he could make the fighting stop and all would be well. And I think he very clearly now realizes that there isn't really a satisfactory deal to be done. The only deal that he's going to be offered is essentially the surrender and sacrifice of Ukraine at the expense of Europe's own security. So I think he is just going to have to listen to whatever President Putin has to say and come back another day.
If there is any ceding of Ukrainian territory to Russia, that, of course, will strengthen, embolden President Putin. What are going to be the knock-on effects, in your view, not just for Europe, but for Britain as well?
Well, I think the first and most significant point is, were Ukraine to surrender what is currently 20% of its country under Russian occupation, that would break the precedent that we do not allow this to happen in Europe that's applied since the end of the Second World War. And it would be extraordinarily naive to think that that was somehow a unique experiment, because in President Putin's eyes, he really wants the whole of Ukraine. And he also has his eyes on parts of what are now NATO that used to be part of the former Soviet Union. And so we must absolutely realize that a bad outcome in Ukraine means that this sort of territorial expansion by force could come to the rest of Europe. And nobody should be in any doubt about that risk.
We know that European leaders are going to be speaking to both President Trump and President Zelensky in a few hours. Do you think it's going to be making much of a difference, as we know that President Trump and Putin will be in the room together on their own, no one else in there? What do you make of this?
Well, the fact that President Putin and President Trump meet on their own in a room without interpreters and observers is extraordinary, because nobody other than those two senior gentlemen will know what has been discussed. And that's a very strange way of handling international affairs. But from a European perspective, Europe should be making a couple of things really clear. First, that sacrificing Ukraine just to make the fighting stop is not acceptable. And second, Europe is already shouldering most of the burden for buying weapons for Ukraine from the US to the tune of about $40 billion this year. So that needs to continue. And then second, and it's just as important, that Europe and the US together must accept that the way to make this war stop is to really increase the sanctions on Russia. And this means going back to the idea of secondary sanctions on those big trading nations that buy cheap Russian oil, because the way to make President Putin stop, which is what we should be talking about, is to bring his economy down.
Looking at all the possibilities, one thing is certain, that Europe and the UK will have to continue their support of Ukraine. What is not as certain, though, Sir Richard, is whether the US will continue to do so. There was an interview J.D. Vance gave while he was still in the UK, well, I think it was to Fox News, saying that the US taxpayer is sick of seeing their tax dollars go to Ukraine. He also said that for Europe, this is a problem that I think the words he used was in your neck of the woods. There is language there suggesting that there is a possibility that after Friday's meeting, the US walks away from its support of Ukraine. Is Europe able to maintain that support for Ukraine to help them continue their fight against Russia?
So the key to this is the current situation whereby European taxpayers are buying the weapons that Europe cannot currently produce from American industry. So Europe is already shouldering more of the burden for weapons and ammunition than the US. And given his mercurial nature, President Trump ought to be quite happy with that arrangement because the US taxpayers are paying a lot less. They still need to contribute. And this should continue until Europe does what it really must do, which is ramp up its own defense industry at scale and at pace. And that's going better, as indeed is the increase in industrial production in Ukraine itself. But it's got to go faster. And at the heart of this is really difficult decisions for European political leaders in that the world is as it is, and we are going to have to make bigger sacrifices, not least with our taxes, to support Ukraine to a decent outcome in this terrible war, because that is in our own interest as much as anybody else's.
If the efforts from European countries and the UK have to be stepped up after the outcome of Friday's meeting, having completed the strategic defence review, do you think we're ready? Do you think we're in a good place? Do you think the government has listened to your review?
So I'm really confident that the transformative path that we set out in the Strategic Defence Review puts the UK Armed Forces at the front edge of how you think about and, if necessary, fight war in the 21st century. And this is the biggest transformation for 150 years. The challenge is that there's a long way to go from armed forces that are in a relatively poor state as a result of 35 years of the comfortable post-Cold War era. So there's a big gap to close. And the issue that we're all going to have to confront is right now the money is there to make this transformation work over about 10 years. And you don't have to wait 10 years for everything, but you don't get enough until about 10 years have elapsed as defense spending increases. And it is more likely than not that a combination of how the world is turning out, and that could be Ukraine, what our allies need us to do, and that includes the US doing less for our security, and above all, what our opponents, even enemies, may do, will cause us to go faster. So we're right on the cusp of a very hard national discussion about the balance of what we do with our taxes between welfare and warfare is going to need a bigger slice.
And finally, Sir Richard, what do you think, in your view, with your experience, is the most realistic outcome from Friday's meeting?
I think the most realistic outcome from Friday's meeting is President Trump hears President Putin say he would really like Ukraine to surrender and give in to all of Russia's maximalist war aims, which frankly haven't changed in the last 3.5 years. That President Putin would like the US to walk away from Europe, and President Putin would like the US to stop supplying arms to Ukraine and anybody else, and certainly not put sanctions on Russia. That's what I think he will hear, and we must all hope very much indeed that he rejects all of that.
General Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of Joint Forces Command and co-author of the Strategic Defence Review, thank you for your time.